Good evening and welcome to our Fourscore Speaker Series. Tonight we are joined by Dr. Justene Hill Edwards for a discussion on her latest book, Savings and Trust, The Rise and Betrayal of Freedman's Bank. The book exposes how the rise and tragic failure of Freedman's Bank has shaped economic inequality in America. My name is Phyllis Evans, and I'm the Senior Director of Development at the Lincoln Presidential Foundation. Our foundation is the only national foundation focused on increasing access to history, educational programs, exhibits, and sites highlighting the life and legacy of Abraham Lincoln. We do our work in cooperation and partnership with others, locally, nationally, and globally, with a vision for a world where freedom and democracy flourish, inspired by the life and work of Abraham Lincoln. To learn more about how you can support this mission, please visit our website at lincolnpresidential.org. Before we begin tonight's program, I'd like to remind you that we will entertain questions from the audience, so please type them in the Q&A box below and we'll get to as many as we possibly can. And now, please join me in welcoming our Foundation President and CEO, Erin Carlson Mast. Erin?
Thank you, Phyllis. Greetings, everyone, and thanks for joining us for another Fourscore Speaker Series program. We're delighted to have Dr. Justene Hill Edwards with us tonight to speak on her book, Savings and Trust, The Rise and Betrayal of the Freedmen's Bank. In the years immediately after the Civil War, tens of thousands of formerly enslaved people deposited millions of dollars into the Freedmen's Bank. African Americans envisioned this new bank as a launching pad for economic growth and self-determination. But their trust was betrayed, and only 9 years after it opened, the Freedmen's Bank collapsed. Informed by new archival findings, historian Justene Hill Edwards illuminates the hope and philanthropic intentions with which the bank was first envisioned, how and why bank trustees and employees engaged in risky activity contrary to the bank's bylaws and congressional charter, and illustrates the significant setback that the sabotage of the bank caused in the fight for economic autonomy for tens of thousands of people. Hill Edwards argues for a new interpretation of its tragic failure based on the evidence. The bank's white financiers drove the bank into the ground, not Frederick Douglass, its final president, or its black depositors and cashiers. The book features some well-known figures that you will all be familiar with, like Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, J. and Henry Cooke, and General Howard, and less well-known figures like the Reverend Alvord, Dr. Charles B. Purvis, John Mercer Langston, Congressman Robert Smalls, and Ellen Baptiste Lubin. Justene Hill Edwards is an associate professor of history at the University of Virginia. In addition to writing Savings and Trust, she is the author of Unfree Markets, The Slave's Economy, and the Rise of Capitalism in South Carolina, which was published by Columbia University Press in 2021. She's a specialist in African American history, and her research examines Black economic life in America. She's won several fellowships and awards, including an Andrew Carnegie Fellowship and, most recently, the 2025 Virginia Literary Award for Nonfiction and the 2025 Frederick Douglass Book Prize. She received her PhD from Princeton University. Dr. Edwards, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
You know, I have to say I lived in DC for many years, and so I knew the broad strokes of the history of the Freedmen's Bank and the Freedmen's Bureau, which we'll get into a bit tonight too. And yet, your book proves the point that makes the work of history so important. There is always more to learn. There's new research to uncover, primary sources never before published, and it is the reason that we have this program and others like it, and why we have such a wonderful audience that keeps coming back for more. So taking a step back, though, let's start with your story. What led you to a career in history?
Oh, well, that is, I think, a very kind of winding, non-linear story. I am as surprised as anyone, I think, that I'm a historian. I didn't start out or plan to be a historian and to study African American history. In college, I was a Spanish major. I thought I wanted to go to law school, and after I graduated from Swarthmore College in 2004, I got a job at a law firm as a paralegal to kind of test the waters. And that was an amazing experience because it did two things. One, it showed me that I didn't want to be a lawyer, practice law, or go to law school, which was very instructive. And two, it gave me time to think about what I really wanted to do. And I thought, if I'm going to work this hard, at something, it should be something that I was excited about, that would get me up in the morning, that would pull me through challenging times. So I applied for a master's degree and I got a master's degree in African New World Studies or African Diaspora Studies from Florida International University in Miami. So I got to live in sunny Miami for 2 years, which was a nice break from Pennsylvania and from Philadelphia. And then I decided that I wanted to be trained as a historian, and specifically, I wanted to be trained as a historian of slavery. And so then I got into Princeton. I worked with the amazing historian Tara Hunter for an advisor. And I kind of figured out in that period of time that not only did I want to be a historian of slavery, but I couldn't articulate it then, but I can now. I wanted to understand African American economic life, and I wanted to study really the period of slavery to understand how the enslaved thought about money, thought about their finances, thought about finance writ large. And so that interest really kind of spurred my desire to be a historian who's interested in the intersection of slavery and capitalism, and it really kind of pushes my research in that direction.
Well, and that leads perfectly into why this book and why now? Like what prompted this particular book?
Yeah, yeah. So my first book, which I published in 2021, was based off of my PhD, and it's called Unfree Markets: The Slaves Economy and the Rise of Capitalism in South Carolina. And in that book, I looked at the evolution of the slaves economy. And
Mm.
so that is when the enslaved found ways to make money, to trade, to barter for goods, and really be involved and invested in the economic lives of their communities. I was really fascinated by this idea of slaves with money, and I wanted to know what they did with money, how they earned money, but importantly, I wanted to understand kind of how slaves in this environment of kind of slavery could both earn money and how it was legal. And I came to find out that yes, it was legal. It was not uncommon for the enslaved to kind of sell goods to their enslavers. But what I was really struck by was that this idea, the reality or the practicality of slaves with money did not mean that they could do things that they really wanted to do, which was to buy their freedom and the freedom of their families. And so there was kind of a quandary, a tension at the heart of that book to understand this relationship. And so then I defended in 2015. I started at the University of Virginia in 2016. And when I started, I was, of course, thinking about what I wanted my second project to be. And at that time, I also lived in Washington, D.C. And at the time, my now husband was kind of walking around the National Mall and came home one day and asked me about the Freedmen's Bank because there had been a plaque that was just erected on the Treasury Annex. I didn't know much about it. Interestingly enough, and I'll say this probably a few times today, this is the anniversary of the founding of
Yeah.
both the Freedmen's Bank and the Freedmen's Bureau. They were both founded on the same day, March 3rd, 1865. And so I knew that, but I didn't really know anything else. And as any good historian will do, they go and look at what else has been written on the particular topic that they're interested in. And I was really shocked to find that there wasn't much written about it. At the time, there were only a handful of scholarly articles and two books. The first book published in 1924, and the second book published in 1976. And
Mhm.
so I was thinking this would be a great second project. One, it kind of was a fully encapsulated project to understand the history of this bank, but to kind of get a broader sense of this world of finance and risk and capitalism. At the time, studying the history of capitalism was incredibly popular. I think because of the aftermath of the financial crisis and the financial crash. And so all of these things were kind of swirling around, and I thought, I think this would be a great second book. And I was fortunate enough to win two really competitive fellowships that gave me time and resources to really focus on this book and to write it. And so, what you all read was the kind of evolution of my research agenda in kind of thinking about the economic lives of African Americans in slavery and then immediately after slavery's end during Reconstruction.
Amazing. Well, as you said, tonight does mark the anniversary. It was on this date that Congress passed and Lincoln signed the act creating the Freedman Savings and Trust Company, which we are going to be referring tonight mostly as the Freedmen's Bank. And it was one of the last pieces of legislation of that Congress and one of Lincoln's final acts in his first term in office.
Mhm.
And first and foremost, I'd like you to talk about like this was intended as a benevolent enterprise. There were philanthropists involved, abolitionists, reformers who believed that savings banks could be a mechanism of uplift. It was also responding in part to a need, though there was some mismatch, as you detail, between what they thought the newly freed need and what the newly freed wanted. But this connects also to what you were just speaking about, which is that there's even those who were enslaved, not to mention free blacks living in the South and the North, even those who were enslaved were not, they had some level of financial literacy,
Mhm.
but they did not necessarily have access to financial services. So can you talk about who were the people behind the founding of the bank? What drew them to this project, and what need was it meeting or not meeting?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, studying kind of the history of savings banks, especially in this period or broader in the 19th century, is fascinating because I think it gives us a broader understanding of just the landscape of financial services here. We're not talking about a plethora of banks.
Yeah.
The first savings banks really started as benevolent institutions, nonprofit organizations to further the philanthropic goals of the wealthy and the political elite in places like Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. And so the founders of the Freedmen's Bank were again a who's who of white abolitionists, ministers, politicians, bankers, philanthropists who understood this trend and believed that they could help the recently emancipated in the South kind of build their economic and financial lives as an important step out of slavery into this new period of freedom. And so the founder, though, his name was John Alvord, and he was a minister, an abolitionist living in New Jersey with his family. And in 1864, and really the summer and fall of that year, he worked as an attaché for Union General William T. Sherman. And on this kind of journey for him that he was taking, he took the opportunity to speak to as many freed African Americans as possible. And he asked them about their goals and their aspirations for this fragile transition out of slavery into freedom. And they told him that first they wanted to be reunited with their families, and second, they wanted access to land because they themselves understood practically that building wealth was important and wealth in land and property would help them kind of reach their financial and economic goals. And so John Alvord goes to New York in January of 1865, and he gathers a who's who of these politicians, philanthropists, bankers, and says, why don't we create a savings bank for the recently emancipated? And so this was kind of a lightning idea. It quickly gathers support. And so it goes quickly, I say too quickly.
Rushed, if you will. Yeah.
Rushed, absolutely. From an idea, it rushes through Congress with the overwhelming support of radical Republicans. There were a few, Simon Cameron of Pennsylvania, for example, who says that he's not sure if this is a great idea without proper vetting. His reservations would be prescient. But Lincoln signs the act to create the Freedmen's Bank on March 3rd of 1865, and off they go to create a savings bank for African Americans.
So, in reading through this and foreshadowing some of the catastrophes that happen with the bank later, I think it's helpful to understand that the Civil War really transformed national banking and finance, and the war itself created the need for a bank like the Freedmen's Bank. Could you describe the largely state regulated landscape before the Civil War, and then how the Civil War creates a situation like what might be considered precursors to the Freedmen's Bank, the military
Mm,
savings banks that you go into in your book, to sort of give people like what existed before this, what were
mhm,
its
mhm.
precursors?
Yeah. So this period in American history, especially American financial history, is incredibly fascinating. On the one hand, we are talking about prior to 1862 and 1863, we have state banks creating their own currencies. We have thousands of different types of currencies that were kind of operating in this financial landscape. And it was kind of the wild, wild west of monetary policy at this point. Lincoln comes in, the Civil War starts. He is raising money in bond sales. Jay and Henry Cooke from Ohio are incredibly instrumental in helping the Union raise like $1 billion at this time to fund the war effort. Um, but African Americans are kind of starting to kind of tap into this. And we are talking about a period of time when Black men are being paid for their military service with the Union. And so we have three generals who decide to open kind of pet savings banks to help their Black soldiers save money for themselves and their families. The first is in New Orleans. The second is in Beaufort, South Carolina, and the third is in Norfolk, Virginia. And these banks, called military savings banks, were established to help African American soldiers save money and send money back to their families. Now, again, these banks were kind of organized haphazardly. Interestingly enough, they were not regulated
Yeah.
by the institution that was supposed to regulate these types of banks. The Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, the OCC, which is still alive to today, was the nation's first financial regulator. It's established in February of 1863 to kind of regulate this transition into the dollar, to regulate transitioning state banks into national banks. And so these three military savings banks were not governed by the comptroller. Instead, they were supposed to be regulated by Congress.
Mm.
Um, this again kind of speedily put together. But despite this, these banks were incredibly popular. One bank, a bank branch in Norfolk specifically, got about $75,000 in Black men's deposits by the end of 1864. And we're talking about these banks being established that summer. And so they were kind of test banks to see if African Americans would be excited customers of these types of banks, and it provided bankers who were supporting the Freedmen's Bank with a kind of test case to see how Black men in particular, if they would be kind of responsible with the risk of banking. This is an idea that continues through the history of the Freedmen's Bank, but the bank is these military banks are successful, and they kind of are a proving ground for the creation of the Freedmen's Bank a few months later.
Yeah. And financial autonomy wasn't just, and being able to safeguard your money, being able to place your money somewhere safe, and financial autonomy wasn't just a practical matter.
Mhm.
One of the things that comes through loud and clear in your book is that it's intertwined. This idea of saving and financial autonomy is intertwined with messages of morality and citizenship and freedom itself. Can you
Mhm.
speak to that concept in general and how that also played into the messaging of Freedman's Bank?
Yeah, I mean this idea of the kind of democratic responsibility of risk taking was incredibly important. And that it was kind of baked into the marketing materials that the bank's administrators were disseminating once the bank was up and running in 1865, kind of connecting this idea of being a moral person, being a citizen, being kind of a responsible part of of the body politic, and connecting it to the ability to save money, to not buy goods such as liquor or jewelry or fancy clothing. And so some of the marketing material even said to forego liquor and jewelry and clothing and instead put extra money in a Freedman's bank account. And so they were directly connecting kind of these two ideas about morality and saving.
How much was that ignoring just a practical matter that sometimes people need access to liquidity? Like where it does feel like there is this tension or mismatch
Mhm.
between the need for maybe more commercial banking services or like a checking account versus what this savings and trust was set up as.
Mhm.
And that tension seems to underpin part of one of the fundamental flaws of the bank.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And the reality was that the Freedmen's Bank was established again as a benevolent institution. It was essentially operating like a nonprofit. We would
Mhm.
say it was kind of a nonprofit institution. It was not supposed to operate with the goal of making money because there were no shareholders. It was a benevolent nonprofit institution. And the goal was to encourage depositors to deposit money, to keep their money in the bank for long enough for the bank's investments to make a profit. And so the bank was investing in very low risk financial products where we're talking about kind of governmental bonds and securities.
Mhm.
And so very low risk. Um, and the bank's administrators and founders were trying to encourage African Americans to keep their money in the bank for long periods of time, where we're talking about 6 months to years, right? What they didn't understand, though, and what this kind of fundamental tension is that you just mentioned, was that African Americans thought about kind of wealth and wealth building and saving in a different way. And that was incredibly important. They thought about banking in terms of helping them to save money in the short term, and then they would withdraw money to buy what they really wanted. For them, they wanted land, they wanted machinery, they wanted livestock, they wanted the ability to move closer to family, kin, and community. That was what was valuable to them. That was tangible. They came from an environment where kind of wealth was tangible. They held capital in their bodies, right? Enslaved women birthed capital when they had a child. And so they thought about kind of money and wealth and capital in kind of a very tangible way. And so this kind of idea clashed in terms of how African Americans were engaging with the bank and the bank's administrators, and how the bank's white administrators were trying to force African Americans to think about themselves as bank customers.
Yeah. So we already have a couple questions here, so I'm going to
Right?
bring these into the conversation. And one is related to what my next, question or topic was the fact that the Freedmen's Bank was also on the vanguard of branch banking,
Yes.
right? We keep talking about this as a bank, and it
Mhm.
originally was located in New York City. It
Mhm.
moves to DC, which is a very consequential move, which
Yes.
we will want to hear you say a lot about that. Um, but the question was the bank in one state or a number of states? So can you address the fact that this is like the branch banking aspect of this and some of them, just the variety of places where this bank was operating?
Yeah, I mean, the fascinating part about that is the Freedmen's Bank was the one of the first banks to operate in kind of the branch banking system. Again, it was supposed to be regulated by the comptroller. Because the transition to like a national banking system, the transition of banking in one have of having a main branch in one state and kind of satellite branches in another state was actually new. And so the Freedmen's Bank was one of these first banks operating under this new system. But the Freedmen's Bank starts to grow pretty quickly. It starts in Virginia with branches in Norfolk, kind of transitioning off of the military savings bank there. There are kind of two branches in South Carolina. There are branches in Florida, in Georgia. There were proposed branches in Texas, and I can talk about that in the Q&A because that is, I think, a really important part of this story. But at its height, and so in 1872, there were 37 branches across 17 states, as far north as New York, as far south as Tallahassee, Florida, and then as far west as St. Louis. And so there are bank branches specifically in places with a high density of African Americans living there. And so we're talking about centers most specifically in the former Confederate South, with Virginia having the highest number of bank branches. But yeah, I mean, this was kind of a sprawling institution that was again in the vanguard of banking at this time, especially for a savings bank. But it is worth saying. I note that that date, 1872. Um, what happened in 1867 to 1868 to 1870 is actually incredibly important. Um, the bank's main branch was in New York from 1865 to 1867. At this period of time, John Alvord is not yet the bank's president. He's not president until 1868. And he is encouraging members of the Board of Trustees to think about moving the main branch from New York to Washington, D.C. He says that there's a larger, a more politically active Black community there. They can tap into their connections with the federal government. And he can bring on more influential trustees. And so that's exactly what he does. In early 1867, the bank moves from New York to DC. They buy a beautiful new building that if you walk by, you can walk by the site where the Freedman's Bank was today, and there are two plaques memorializing this. And it is right within the White House complex. It's in front of Treasury and adjacent to the White House. And so it was really in the seat of kind of political and economic power at this time, and that was by design.
Yeah. You shared what the geographic scope was, but at its, I think that the numbers that I wrote here are at its peak. And one of the things that you all will appreciate when you read this book, if you haven't read it yet, is that Justine provides the what the monetary value was then and what the conversion to current, what the equivalent would be now. So
Hmm.
if I have this, I think this was the peak. The Freedmen's Bank had approximately 100,000 accounts
Hmm.
that held
Hmm.
around 50 million, which is the equivalent of roughly $1.4 billion today.
Yeah. And
So
that's a
that also,
conservative estimate.
uh,
That's actually conservative. Yeah. Hmm.
yeah. So that's, I hope you all can appreciate that we're talking about a really sprawling institution that also is touching a lot of lives because everyone who has a bank account is also potentially representing that many more people and the communities around them.
Hmm.
Um, can you say a little bit about who the depositors were? Because it was men and women, but can you talk a little bit about who they were, generally speaking?
Yeah, I mean, they were a cross section of African Americans from the relatively politically well connected in the North, again, in places like DC, in places like New York and Philadelphia, but we're also talking about the formerly enslaved. And so I kind of pick out specific depositors to hone in on throughout the book. And I think that one of the most, I think, kind of provocative examples is a family from Richmond, Virginia in 1870. Um,
Please
uh,
tell that story. I loved that story. Yeah.
yeah, the Harris family, they go into the bank the first week of February of 1870, and this is immediately after the ratification of the 15th Amendment. Robert and Betsy Harris are parents, they're married, and they bring their two children, a son and a daughter. Oh gosh, named, why am I blanking on her name now? Um, Oh my goodness. I've gone
You
through
touch
this.
on her at the end of the book too. It's
Yes,
yeah.
yes, I do. But they bring in a daughter. She's 11. It'll come to me. And Robert and Betsy Harris, they bring in their children to kind of introduce them to this idea of banking. They had opened accounts a few days earlier. And so they bring in their daughter in particular to open a bank account and you kind of see the depositor records. It's fascinating. It says where they live, which is Richmond. It says their neighborhood. It says that the first deposit is made by her father. And
Mhm.
then it also says that her occupation here is going to school, which I
I
love.
love
And so it's possible that she is the first member of her family who knows how to read and write her name. And so it's this kind of beautiful story of a Black family in the immediate aftermath of the ratification of the 15th Amendment, kind of coming in, opening accounts, and especially opening an account for their daughter to kind of introduce her to this idea of banking being an essential part for her of this transition from slavery to freedom.
Can you also, on the other side of the spectrum there, so you have young schoolgirl, Congressman Smalls, that was an amazing story
Mm.
too. Can you speak a bit to his story as one of the bank's depositors as well?
Yeah, Robert Smalls opens an account in the Beaufort branch, and I kind of narrate how he's kind of walking down Bay Street in Beaufort, and he's probably thinking about everything that he had been through in the previous years, being kind of a war hero during the war, stealing a Confederate ship, delivering it to Union forces, and how he's kind of making his way again in this new period of freedom, creating for himself a political career, speaking out in favor and advocating for the political rights of African Americans, especially the formerly enslaved. And he goes in and he opens an account. And this is around the time that he actually purchases his childhood home, the home that his mother was enslaved in, that he was enslaved in, and they lived in the back of. And so it's kind of connecting again these really important historical figures of the war and Reconstruction to this one financial institution, I think, in really interesting ways. It brings together, for me, it was a very surprising cast of characters who were kind of colliding in the history of this one financial institution.
Yeah. And this sort of theme of disruptions and things occurring around it, because there are always going to be external factors,
Mm,
whenever there's an event like this, which ultimately is the bank failure that we're talking about. But, we did talk about the fact that Lincoln signs this on March 3rd, 1865. You know, within a few weeks, he's assassinated.
mm.
How did that event in particular, what effect did it have, if any, on the operation of the Freedmen's Bank?
Sure. I mean, if anything, it accelerated the expansion of the bank. It encouraged African Americans to patronize their branches when possible, when branches opened up in their cities. It really spurred the bank's wide administrators to kind of get out there and hustle, to kind of spread the good word of the good work that the bank was doing. And so, if anything, the assassination of Lincoln really did accelerate the pace at which the bank kind of spread, both for better and for worse.
So I want to get into the DC stuff next because that's where the really shocking and shameless and juicy stuff happens. But
Mm,
we do have a question that relates also to the depositors that I want to get to before we go there from George, who says it's surprising to him that a significant number of newly emancipated people would have a sort of nest egg, including even if they had just come out of bondage.
mm,
And so he wondered if you have an estimate of the total amounts across the population that there may have been. He was wondering about the magnitude. We did
mm,
mention what was deposited in the bank at its height, but I
mm,
think in answering his question, if you could speak to the messaging about saving small sums
mm.
too.
Yeah, I mean, there was this idea that bank administrators were kind of marketing to African Americans, and one of this kind of maxims that they use was save the small sums. And so they were encouraging depositors to deposit from 5 cents to 15 cents to $1, and that they would say that over time, if you leave your money in the bank, you would have more money over time, right? The benefits of compounding interest payments were really important to how the bank was kind of advertising to African Americans. And so again, I mean, Black folks were kind of bringing their ideas about money, about finance, about fiscal responsibilities with them. And these ideas and this knowledge was forged through the violence of slavery. I talk about that quite a bit. That all of their ideas were kind of constructed around how to best save money, how to invest in the wealth for their families and for their communities. And so this was incredibly important. And the bank's administrators were tapping into that, saying if you even just put a small sum in the bank, it will grow and it'll help you reach not just your economic goals and dreams, but your political goals and dreams as well.
Yeah. So we also have two questions I'm seeing now about what incentives did people have for depositing funds in the Freedmen's Bank, and
Hmm.
did they provide loans to the newly emancipated? And there's a similar question on the lending side. To what degree, if at all, did the bank's charter facilitate business capital formation in the formerly
Hmm.
enslaved communities?
Hmm.
So, and I raise both of those because those are
Yeah.
relevant to the DC part.
Hmm.
But can you talk
Yeah.
about that, what they were chartered to do, like what they were
Hmm.
legally allowed to do?
Hmm. Hmm.
And then we need to get into the DC stuff because there's just too much to talk about there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of DC stuff. So yeah, so the bank was designed and constructed as a simple savings bank, and the bank's administrators were encouraging African Americans to leave their money in the bank for 6 years to, first, excuse me, 6 months to about a year to help the bank make money on their investments, and they would pass along a small amount of interest. Where we're talking like 2 to 4% to depositors if they left their money in the bank for 6 months or 8 months or a year. And so again, it was operating on a very slim margin. But in terms of lending, the bank was not supposed to lend money. And this was a concern of a handful of politicians in Congress in 1865 who were afraid that despite the bank's benevolent mission, that African Americans' money would just sit there and that the bank's trustees would start to kind of chip away and take money for themselves. And that's exactly what happened, right? And so
Yep.
the bank moves to DC in early 1867. John Alvord encourages Henry Cooke to join the board. He brings on two of his business associates. Um, and they go on to make the first illegal loan in April of 1867. Just a couple weeks later, it is for about $1,000 to a man named D.L. Eaton. And Eaton would go on to join the bank as the bank's actuary about 2 weeks later. And so,
Yeah, folks, you heard that right, by the
yeah,
way. Yeah.
yeah,
So,
yeah. He receives a loan approved by Cooke. Cook and D.L. Eaton are friends and business partners. They invest in businesses together in DC. And he takes this first loan. He pays it back. But after that, the bank's finance committee, which Henry Cooke runs, starts to make about $75,000 of legal loans. And he makes them again to his friends, to his business partners between 1867 and 1870. Now, what happens in 1869 and 1870 is that Cooke spearheads this campaign to lobby members of Congress to agree to amend the bank's charter. He says, look, if we make loans, then we can get a higher rate of interest, a dividend payment for the bank's Black depositors. This would be in their best interest for Congress to amend the bank's charter to allow us to make loans because right now the margin is slim. Um, There is a small amount of debate. There are a handful of senators in particular who says this is a horrible idea. You know what's going to happen to African Americans' money. It's going to be spent and squandered. But the bill passes Congress. And as of May 1870, the bank no longer operates as a savings bank. It operates as a commercial bank, and the floodgates open. And the bank's finance committee starts to make millions of dollars of unsecured loans, mostly to whites in and around Washington, D.C., who have personal and professional ties and connections to members of the bank's board.
Yeah. And I'm not sure how familiar our audience is with the governance of DC,
Mm.
um, but Henry Cooke was also the
The first
governor.
territorial governor of Washington, D.C.
We've got layers upon layers of
Yes, he is
conflicts of
appointed by
interest.
Grant in 1871. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So I guess, I mean, can you say a little bit more about like, so there is the OCC, there are regulatory bodies that are supposed to be overseeing it. So Cook
Hmm.
convinces Congress to amend the charter to allow for more loan activity. But even then, even then, there are supposed to be certain guidelines on the type of things that count as collateral, the value
Hmm.
that they have to have, and those are all being ignored, and illegal activity continues to proliferate. What
Yeah.
where's oversight? Where's regulation in all of
Yeah,
this?
yeah. And so, but between 1870 and 1872, they make about probably a million to $1.5 million in loans. And according to Congress, a part of the Charter Amendment was that the loans were supposed to be secured by real estate twice the value of the loan. And so we're talking about property, we're talking about real estate. That quickly goes out the window. The trustees and the finance committee make loans to anyone that they believe is credit worthy. They accept no collateral. They accept stocks and bonds as collateral. Interestingly enough, I found like YMCA stock as collateral, which is really interesting at this point, considering it was a racially segregated institution. Um, and so trustees themselves take loans, which was not supposed to happen under the Charter Amendment. The biggest loan went to one of the biggest loans went to Henry Cooke, who exchanges bad debt from J. Cooke and Company, him and his brother's investment bank, and he essentially receives about $500,000 in loans from the bank.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm going to leave that one there for
Yeah.
now. We have a couple questions about what sort of
Mhm.
interest rates were paid in the 1870s in this period.
Hmm.
Like, were these typical interest rates, I guess, is a way of looking at
Hmm.
that.
Hmm.
And someone asked the question, if the bank wasn't supposed to loan out money for interest, how was it supposed to make a profit? And so I
Hmm.
think that's another
Yeah.
important point is it was supposed to be a nonprofit
It was supposed to be a
originally.
nonprofit. It was supposed to
Yeah.
grow slowly to allow the bank's low risk investments to pay a dividend. Um, and so the fact that the bank's finance committee was making loans, both legal and illegal. The fact that the bank was expanding so quickly. I mean, 37 branches was a lot. Instead of renting office space in certain places, they were buying entire buildings. And so financially, the bank was not in good hands. And it is worth saying that that one of the reasons why this happens is because John Alvord is the president from 1868 to 1874. It is important to note that John Alvord claimed to be a philanthropist. He was a minister. But he was not a banker. And even so, um, during the first 2 years of his tenure at the Freedmen's Bank, he was like a secretary and then a first and second vice president and then president. He had financial problems with his family. He couldn't provide them with a home to live in, or he was really struggling. Interestingly enough, once he moves to DC, within 2 years, the value of his family's wealth triples. And so he makes strategic investments in businesses that are owned by members of the board of trustees, most importantly, Henry Cooke. And so he starts to kind of um, build his own family's wealth off of his connections and affiliations with the bank. But he's not a banker. And so
And it's not his only job.
no, he is working as a superintendent of schools for the Freedmen's Bureau. And really in 1872 and 73, the Board of Trustees actually brings him in and says, like, look, you have to focus on the bank because things are not in a good position now. And he's spread too thin. He's traveling around the South with the Freedmen's Bureau, examining Freedmen's Bureau schools and hospitals while trying to maintain his stature as the president of the Freedmen's Bank. And for the best banker and financial mind, this would be too much, and it certainly was for him.
Yeah. So he does sort of, get encouraged to retire from the position, but he doesn't leave the board. And then
Hmm.
there are other trustees that come in. There's a bit of a shakeup. Henry
Hmm.
Cooke and D.L. Eaton
Are
are
booted
sort
out.
of, yeah, they're booted out. So can you talk about the trustees that come in that start to try to shake things up and or that see that something's not right here? And
Yeah.
there were some reports too being done, I
Hmm.
think, by the
Hmm.
OCC at that point, which point to the
Yeah.
bad things, but also sort of put a glossy spin on it to
Hmm.
avoid like creating a bank rush or something. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And so Congress finally mandates the comptroller to do an examination that happens in February of 1873. The bank's examiner kind of examines the books of the DC branch and says that like things are not in good shape. Loans are in default. Borrowers aren't paying back their money. The bank needs to shape up. There are branches throughout the South where depositors have to wait 60 or 90 days to make withdrawals. This is a massive problem. This was a problem too because all of the money or a majority of the money that depositors were putting into their bank accounts was not being held at the branches. It was being sent to DC to fund the loans that were kind of making the bank unstable at this point. And so, yes, the comptroller does an examination in February 1873 and says that things are bad, but I have every faith in this esteemed board of trustees that they can right the ship. That does not happen. There is another damning examination in February of 1874. And this one is bad. It reaches the news, it's made public. About half of the branches are examined, and all of this information comes out about depositors not trusting the bankers and the cashiers. By this point, about 40% of the cashiers, the bank managers, are Black. But what happens is that some of the branches that are examined that have Black bank cashiers are actually in good shape. But the Black depositors say that they realize that this is a dragnet. That is what one St. Louis examination says, that the depositors know that their money is being sent to DC, and whites are being allowed to borrow from the bank in ways that make them feel really upset. And they said that this money would be better used to lend in the communities in which they are being received. It is kind of a preface to the Community Reinvestment Act of 1977, interestingly enough. But so yeah, all of this is happening. There's this damning examination. The board at this point is experiencing a shakeup. Some new, more activist trustees come on, a handful of whom about two or three are Black, at any given point, and they start to say, okay, look. Alvord needs to step down. We have no faith that he knows what he's doing. But instead of putting another banker or putting a banker in the position, in early 1874, really in March of that year, they nominate Frederick Douglass to be the president of the Freedmen's Bank, and he takes a position in March of 1874, and he is completely stunned and shocked by the status of the bank. He believed he had been an early supporter of the bank. He himself and his sons were depositors. Um, when he ran his newspaper in DC, he would run monthly, if not weekly at times, advertisements for the bank, kind of celebrating its public success. And so he is just stunned by the state of the bank at this point.
Yeah. Um, Prior to Frederick Douglass being brought on in 1874, we have the Panic of 1873.
Yes.
Can you talk about that? Because in addition to just creating a sense of panic, there are people directly involved in that who are directly involved in the Freedmen's Bank. And so I think that's a really
Yeah.
important event for our audience to understand. Can you speak about that?
Yeah, the Panic of 1873 was a financial depression. It starts in Eastern Europe, and then it kind of makes waves across Western Europe, across the Atlantic, and hits the US. The main catalyst, though, of Americans feeling this financial depression was the bankruptcy, the failure of J. Cooke and Company. Now, by this point, J. Cooke and Company, with Henry Cooke being instrumental in this, begin to make massive investments of capital in America's railroads. This is seen as being an important but a highly speculative venture. He goes to Western Europe to do a bond sale, the same thing that he did during the war, but he does not experience the same type of success. So he's over leveraged. Jay Cook and Company are over leveraged. They declare bankruptcy in September of 1873, and that immediately causes the US to kind of fall into this depression. Banks close. There are runs on banks, including the Freedmen's Bank. There are runs throughout the South on bank branches, and depositors can't get their money. And so we see kind of a series of events, especially from 1870 onward, that really dooms the bank to failure. And so when Frederick Douglass says yes to being the president, he writes in an autobiography later on, it is the worst humiliation of his life. He would spend the rest of his life kind of exculpating himself, saying it wasn't my fault. Um, he actually wrote, "I was married to a corpse."
Yeah, that was stunning, that line. I mean, he has a lot of a lot of the comments he made. So, I mean, let's talk about that. The Let's talk about the autopsy of that corpse, really.
Yeah.
So the bank fails 3 months after Frederick Douglass is installed as the president. It's easy
Mm,
to see him as a scapegoat, that they
mhm.
sort of set him up for failure in a way, potentially, or expected way too much, thought that he was going to come in and somehow be able to recover the bank from all the wrongs and
Yeah.
wrongdoing of the past 9 years. Um, Congress sets up hearings, right? So there's an
Mhm.
immediate, we have to have a commission. It's going to take 2 years to go through the books with these
Yeah.
commissioners. We're going to have all these hearings. Can you talk about how long that goes on and what comes of it? We do have a question from an audience member who wants to know, did accountability ever occur? Who went to prison? It's a
Uh,
disappointing answer, but it's an
yeah.
important conversation.
Well, I'll start with that question. No one went to prison. No one was prosecuted for the crime of financial malfeasance with the bank. And so what happens is that this really starts in 1874 in the fall of that year. Congress mandates that the bank closes. There's some back and forth with the trustees, without Alvord saying, no, we can save the bank, and the trustees saying, no, we need to let this die. At the time of the bank's closing, there are about 61,000 depositors who have about $2.9 million still left in the bank. Compare that with the fact that the bank had about $50,000 in cash and not a lot of money in bonds. Um, Compare that with the fact that there were about $3.5 million of outstanding loans, the majority of which was in default. Um, and to make matters worse, the bank's finance committee even makes a loan in June and July of that year, despite the fact that Congress is mandating that the bank closes. And so
Yeah. Well,
malfeasance continues up until the bank's failure.
and even though they pushed out Eaton as the actuary, a family member, a relation,
Yeah,
Stickney
his
comes in
nephew,
and
George
yes,
Stickney.
and he's the one making some of these illegal loans after the
Yeah,
bank's closed. So
yeah.
yeah, I mean, it's like, is there no shame, you know?
And there wasn't. And so Congress mandates that there are three commissioners who were made responsible for liquidating the bank's assets to try to pay back the depositors. Interestingly enough, those commissioners got paid first before depositors. But there's an immediate debrief in the fall of 1865, excuse me, 1874. And a bunch of information comes out about the state of the lending, about how much cash the individual branches had, the profile of depositors who still had money in the bank. And so this comes out, and there's an immediate uproar in Black communities across the South. Another uh, and so what happens is that the commissioners issue kind of a series of repayments. There are five repayments, the highest of which was only 15% of the money left in the bank accounts. The lowest was about 5%. And so by 1890, all of the money had been kind of given out. It equates to, I think it's about 40 something percent of the money was given out, which means that the majority of depositors never received money that they had in their accounts when the bank failed. And so this kind of tells us a longer story, right? There are two additional congressional inquiries into the bank, one in 1876. The last one in 1879 by Black Senator Blanche K. Bruce. He knows that he's not going to be reelected, but he calls together an important cast of historical characters to kind of bring them to Congress to force them to testify. And we're talking about Fredrick Douglass, who again is trying to clear his name. Um, John Alvord, who by this time says he doesn't remember anything, and the only thing he wants to do is join his family in Colorado. So he's really of no help. Henry Cooke is called to testify, and he's no help either. Interestingly enough, in an autobiography that he writes later, he says that he's called by God, Cooke is, to be a man of banking and finance, which is fascinating. Um, but yeah, and so all this information comes out, but no one is called to account for their participation in the bank. The vast majority of loans remained unpaid, and African Americans would spend really into the 1930s trying to beg presidents, members of Congress, attorneys generals, comptrollers for money that their family members held in accounts, but to no avail.
Yeah. Well, and even thinking about the other events that were happening in the decades after that, and you also have
Hmm.
things like the Tulsa Race Massacre and Black Wall Street being,
Hmm.
violently destroyed. I mean, this is a form of
Hmm.
violence that we're talking about here, for the
Absolutely.
depositors. But then you also have the Wall Street crash of 1929. So there are a lot of other things that are compounding this potential, these setbacks, these harms, this idea that you might have a mistrust in banks too. How did
Absolutely.
people recover from this? Did they recover from it? And what if there weren't consequences of people being imprisoned for all the
Hmm.
illegality, you
Hmm.
know, was there any sense that the government needed to, I mean, not obviously the regulations didn't help in this case, but
Yeah.
how did people recover? How did
Yeah.
communities recover?
Yeah, I mean, well, communities, Black communities did a few things. One, they started to invest in their own financial institutions in places like DC and Richmond. We see this in places in North Carolina, where we see the kind of emergence of Black-owned, Black-run banks and financial institutions. They turn to alternative forms of banking, informal forms of banking where they knew who they were engaging with economically and saving with. Or they just chose to not kind of deal with and interact with traditional financial institutions. As I've been kind of talking about the book over the last year and a half or so, I've talked about the fact that members of my own family, who I just saw this weekend, and we've talked about this quite a bit, it's not uncommon to like put money in coffee cans or
Yeah.
underneath a mattress, right? As a safe way to save money because you know exactly where it is. But there are kind of costs and drawbacks to that by not forming a long-standing and sustained relationship with a financial institution. We know this that kind of ways of building wealth that are very American in terms of home ownership are more challenging, if not
Mhm. Mhm.
absolutely kind of closed off, right? We know that this trust with financial institutions is really important, but financial institutions have needed to build that trust and have not done so. And this is not like a 20th century phenomenon. That's what I've talked about.
Yeah.
We can look at a very particular moment in American history. The first years, the first moments of freedom after the end of slavery to see how that trust was just shattered at this really important moment for African
Mhm.
Americans and for the
Mhm.
nation.
Mhm. So we have one more question and then a final closing question, but one more from the audience. And Emily asks if President Grant took any responsibility for this. And
Mm,
so it was founded under Lincoln on this
yes.
day. Then you
Hmm.
have Andrew Johnson, who's then
Hmm.
impeached. Now you have, we go
Hmm.
forward. Did President Grant or any of the presidents who were in office when this was happening take any
Yeah.
responsibility?
None. No. I mean, in many ways, they are really not part of this story because they, especially Grant, really didn't intervene at really important times. And by the time Hayes comes in, makes that really important and damaging bargain with Democrats. Kind of the hope for salvaging the bank, for salvaging the deposits of African Americans is completely lost.
Yeah. So, Justine, thank you so much for writing this book and doing this research and
Thank
taking
you.
this time for us. What's your next project?
Yes, the question. So right now I am, and this might be a little funny, think it is. I'm writing a short history of inequality in America. It's kind
A
of like a
short history. Okay.
um, it's based on a class I taught last semester, but I'm really interested in kind of the historical trajectory of ideas and policies that have become kind of so embedded in American history, and so I'm tracking that through. And so that's what I'm working on like now. But I'm going to be embarking on a different project. I'm interested in kind of what happens during Reconstruction, really up until Tulsa,
Hmm.
of Black towns and cities that were kind of founded by and for African Americans, and I'm finding that there are quite a few from Florida to North Carolina to the Midwest to places like Oklahoma and even as far west as California. And I'm finding this in a very particular period of time, really Reconstruction to 1920. And I'm kind of interested in how that came to be, and kind of what that tells us about this longer trajectory in history of African Americans thinking about wealth and land for themselves and their families and their communities.
That's fascinating. Well, and one of our, so we're partnered with the National Park Service, including at Lincoln Home. And one of the sites managed with Lincoln Home is New Philadelphia, in
Mm,
Illinois, which speaks
yeah,
to that,
yeah,
to
yeah.
your next project too. Well, thank you again so much, Justine. It was a pleasure having you here with us tonight. Phyllis, back to you.
All right. Yes, truly wonderful. So many fascinating nuggets of information tonight. I'll be mulling this over for hours. So, next up, our Fourscore Speaker Series will be bringing you author Leon M. Hudson on Tuesday, April 7th at 7 p.m. for a discussion on his latest book, Black Americans in Mourning, Reactions to the Assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Visit our website at lincolnpresidential.org today and register. Finally, as you close out tonight's webinar, we thank you in advance for taking just a moment to complete a short survey. And as always, thank you for joining us this evening, and we hope to see you all in April. Good night.